Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Haley Johnson and will be serving as the moderator for today's digital event. Today, we'll be discussing the hot topic of fraud detection, and more specifically within the context of identity theft and cybercrime. This topic is more timely and relevant than ever. According to PwC's 2020 Global Economic Crime and Fraud Survey, fraud accounted for $42 billion in financial losses in the 24 months preceding to the COVID-19 pandemic. In today's forum, we will hear from a world-renowned expert of fraud and identity theft, Frank Abagnale. Frank has over 30 years of service within the FBI, focused on identity theft, so he has a lot of great applicable knowledge to share with us today. But that's not all. In case you haven't watched the well-known movie and one of my personal favorites, Catch Me If You Can, I think you will find that there is more to Frank than meets the eye. We'll begin with him sharing some of his own life story, followed by some wisdom from his experience fighting cybercrime and fraud as an FBI agent. After that, we'll switch gears to a Q&A format where we'll hear from our Redis Labs Field CTO, Allen Terleto, on what he is seeing across our own enterprise customer base. Frank and Allen will discuss technology, industry trends, and hopefully have some fun along the way. With that being said, let's bring in Frank so we can learn a little bit more about the man behind the movie. Frank, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Haley, and thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. I've been asked to spend just a few minutes about my life. As you know, I've had many people tell my story. I had a great writer write a book about my life, a great film director make a movie about my life, a great Broadway musical team make a Tony Award-winning musical about my life. Each one of those creative people told my story in a different way, sometimes exaggerated in some points and sometimes not. So I thought I'd just take a few minutes to tell you the story from my point of view. I did get in a little bit of trouble when I was a young teenager. My parents were separating. I had a real problem with that and got in a little bit of trouble. But then at the age of 16, my parents decided to get a divorce and I ran away. Back in the 1960s, there were a lot of kids who ran away, but they got caught up in Haight-Ashbury, the hippie scene, the drug scene. Instead, I ended up in the streets of New York City, 16 years old, realized very quickly that I would have to become creative in order to survive. The only asset I had is I looked a lot older than 16, so I altered the date of birth on my driver's license. Back then, didn't have a photo on it, was just an IBM card. And I changed my birth date to make myself 10 years older, or 26 years old. And of course, I started writing checks because it was very easy to do. And I ended up impersonating people because that made the check writing even easier to pass those checks, and ended up impersonating a number of people and writing a number of bad checks, not only in the United States, but around the world. Like any criminal, sooner or later you get caught. I was no exception to that rule. I was arrested by the French police when I was 21 years old. I was convicted of forgery in the French court of law and sent to a French prison. After serving time in France, I was extradited to Sweden, where I was convicted of forgery in a Swedish court of law and sent to a Swedish penitentiary in Malmö, Sweden. When my prison term was up in Sweden, U.S. federal authorities took custody and returned me to the United States, where eventually a United States federal judge sentenced me to 12 years in federal prison. I served 4 of those 12 years at a federal prison in Petersburg, Virginia. When I was 26 years old, the government offered to take me out of prison on the condition I go to work with the federal government for the remainder of my sentence or until my parole had been completed. This was done without compensation, no pay. I was not an employee of the FBI. I was simply paroled, and part of my parole required me to participate and help educating and training FBI agents, only for the period of my parole and no longer. I had a lot of odd jobs coming out of prison. I had to have a job to support myself. I worked at a pizza inn. They found out about my record. They fired me. I drove a bus for a while from downtown Houston out to the airport. They found about my record. They fired me. I went to work for a large grocery store chain as a stocker and ended up an assistant manager. Eventually, they found out about my record and they fired me. At that point in my life, I realized if I could train FBI agents, why couldn't I train bankers, corporations, financial institutions, and realized since I couldn't hide my past, I need to find a way to turn my past around and use it in a very positive way. I am still working with the FBI for over 45 years now. I've had the opportunity to teach at the FBI Academy and teach more than two generations of FBI agents. I've worked for more than 65% of the Fortune 500 companies in America. During the first 20 years of my career, I designed a great deal of technology that went into paper and plastic that people will find in their checks today, corporations' checks, their driver's licenses, their passports. And as time changed over the past 20 years, mainly dealing with cybercrime and identity theft, fraud has changed, but the criminal mind has not changed. I eventually met my wife and married my wife and had 3 children. My oldest boy is an FBI agent. He's been in the Bureau for 15 years, and he is the Bureau's unit chief over the Crisis Negotiations Unit of the FBI. My middle son and his wife own a chain of stores out of Charleston, South Carolina, deals with young ladies' clothing. They've had the business for about 11 years. And my youngest boy, who reads, writes, and speaks Chinese fluently, went to school in China, spent 10 years there developing video games for an American gaming company called Glue Mobile. Eventually, his games became so popular, they brought him back to the United States to be the senior producer on the development of the 25th anniversary of the game Doom, which he played when he was just a young boy. A lot of people say, what changed you? And, you know, I know people would like me to say, well, I was born again. I saw the light. Prison rehabilitated me. But that's not the case. I met my wife 45 years ago, didn't have a dime to my name. I was on parole to the government. And I eventually asked my wife to marry me against the wishes of her parents, as she did. She changed my life. Everything I've had, everything I've achieved, everything I've done is because of the love of a woman and the respect 3 boys have for their father, something I would never, ever jeopardize. Today, I have 6 grandchildren with 1 more on the way to make it number 7. I always like to clarify that for 45 years, I have literally not taken 1 dime from the federal government. I have worked for the Secret Service, the FBI, the CIA, FDIC, the US Treasury, many of the agencies of the federal government who've used my services, but I have never taken any money. When I go up to teach at the Academy in Quantico, Virginia from my home in Charleston, South Carolina, I paid for that transportation. When I go out to our 56 field offices of the FBI to teach agents in in-service training, I pay for my transportation. The government is always willing to reimburse me for my travel and expenses. I've never accepted a dime. As long as I didn't need to do that, I didn't want to do that. I felt the government gave me an opportunity that changed my entire life, and my simple way of repaying my government back. And today, I still teach at the FBI Academy. I teach our CISO Academy, where twice a year we bring in CISOs from 50 Fortune 500 companies. They spend a week at the Academy, and mainly about cybercrime and cyber technology. I work as an advisor to a number of technology companies, as I have for the past 40 years, basically helping them look at technology and asking the simple question, how would someone defeat this technology? How would someone misuse this technology, forever bringing it to the marketplace? And I'm still doing that today. I'm very fortunate that I live in a great country where you can make a mistake, you can pay your debt, and you can get up, brush yourself off, and start all over again. I hope that's what people mostly remember about me. During my career, I've conducted over 3,000 seminars over the past 45 years around the world. I base on 3 simple points. Prevention, number 1. You have to prevent crimes. If you are not doing anything to prevent crime, you're encouraging crime. Today, we have great technology, but if you don't use it, you don't implement it, then you're just waiting to be a victim. Today, the most important thing I teach every employee of every company, the most important job you have, whether you're the CEO, you're the janitor, is keeping your employees and keeping your companies and clients and customers' information safe. And second is verification. Today, we have over $110 billion of court-ordered restitution outstanding. Only about 10% of that money has ever been repaid. Once you lose your money, you will never get your money back. Today, anything can be replicated, duplicated. So it is very important that whenever you're parting with your money or you're parting with information, that you know who's on the other end of that device that you're dealing with, whether that be a consumer dealing with scams or that be the largest company in the world dealing with cybercrime issues. Today, everything has to be verified. And finally, education. Education is the most powerful tool to fighting crime. We live in a country where, thank God, most people are honest. And because they're honest, they don't have a deceptive mind. So they're not sitting there thinking, what would someone do with this information? What would someone do with my identity if I give out this information? Today, educating people and having them understand what the risks are, they're smart enough to then step back and say, well, I'm going to do something to protect myself as long as I have the tools to do that with. But education, whether you're training FBI agents or you're training law enforcement or banks or financial institutions, the most important thing today is education. No matter what technology you have, if you are not training people well, you're just creating future problems. It's a pleasure to be with Alan and Haley today and ready to take any questions you have. Thank you.
Amazing. It really is an incredible story, Frank, and I'm so excited to dig in further as we progress today. But as mentioned, I do want to bring in Allen Terleto, Field CTO for Redis Labs. Allen, would you mind just spending a couple moments talking about your role and Redis Labs as a company?
Sure. Thank you, Haley. And thanks also to Frank for sharing your experience and life story with us. I always found the Leonardo DiCaprio depiction of you intriguing, but honestly speaking, the more I get to hear from the real Frank Abagnale, I actually find the complete story even more captivating. So thanks again for joining us today. As Haley said, my name is Allen Terleto. I am the Field CTO at Redis Labs, home of Redis. Although Redis is extremely popular, it's likely there are some in the audience that may not have heard of it. So let's briefly intro it for some context. Redis is an open source in-memory NoSQL database, which natively supports a variety of data structures and data models that are each natively designed for peak real-time performance and high throughput. Redis is the 7th most popular database in the market today and voted most loved 4 years in a row on Stack Overflow. So when you think about DB2 and Oracle or MongoDB, Redis is right there. Redis open source is used worldwide across transactional, operational, and analytical workloads. It was originally popularized for being the fastest data store in the market with its sub-millisecond performance, its ease of use, and thanks to Redis Labs more recently as a multi-model database. After many years and hundreds of thousands of deployments as a cloud-native database as a service, Redis Labs decided to package their battle-tested knowledge of how to best manage Redis in a cloud-native environment into software called Redis Enterprise that can be deployed by its customers on-prem as a managed service on the cloud or first-class SaaS offering available on GCP, Google's cloud, and Microsoft Azure as the Azure Cache for Redis Enterprise tier. Redis Enterprise picks up right where the open source leaves off, with full compliance to the open source API and full coverage of its data structures and operations, except those that pertain to administration. That caveat exists because Redis Enterprise provides enterprise-grade administrative database capabilities such as linear scalability, high availability, durability, and backup and restore utility, security, and more uniquely, capabilities such as multi-tenancy, active-active geo-replication for business continuity, and tiered data storage to reduce total cost of ownership. Speaking of unique, as mentioned, Redis Labs has extended the foundation of the open source project, which enables Redis Enterprise to be a multi-model database. Redis Enterprise supports the native storage and query capabilities of models such as search and graph, time series, AI and ML models, JSON, and more, a perfect fit for modern day fraud detection systems. But enough about Redis Labs. Let me hand it back over to Haley now, and we'll start the Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Allen. So I probably would have said this back at the point in time, but it seems like Frank's story would almost be impossible to execute on in today's realm of digital technology. I know he talks a lot about this idea of prevention. Can you highlight a bit, are Redis Labs customers still just as focused? Is that a priority for them in terms of fraud?
Yeah, it's absolutely still a priority. In fact, it's growing. In your opening, you mentioned the PwC Economic Crime and Fraud Survey, which focuses on pre-COVID. Since then, online fraud has only accelerated, which is mainly attributed to digital channels becoming the primary means of communication between, most enterprises and their consumers. In other words, as enterprises evolve their operating models to digital-first customer engagement, their risk exposure to global fraud only increases, and global being a key word here. Let's use a overly simplistic example to make a point. If I wanted to rob a bank in the 30s, I'd probably go grab a Tommy gun and a really cool looking three-piece suit and walk to my local branch. But that only has so much reach or exposure, right? Fast forward to Frank's story. By issuing checks, banks became more exposed since they would route checks around the US before fraud was identified. Now let's fast forward to today. A fraudster can commit fraud at scale from the other side of the world where our Justice Department has little jurisdiction. It's a game changer. It's even further complicated since fraudsters can take an omni-channel approach by leveraging the information learned from one channel and use it on the next. Since typically fraud detection solutions are siloed, it's a whole new level of exposure to enterprises. Let me give you some stats. According to the most recent COVID-19 fraud benchmarking report by ACFE, that's the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, 79% of respondents said they saw an increase during COVID of fraud, with 38% said noting that occurrences were significant. So digital channels and transformations are definitely at the heart of this, but it's not the entire story, right? Most organizations are going through a cloud migration as well. With the cloud, most security breaches occur today due to configuration gaps and network omissions because it's a shared responsibility model. Not to steal any thunder here, but I've heard Frank speak before and read some of his work in the past, where he makes the really important point that even with all of our technology, it's typically the mistake of the individual that provides the fraudster a window into the enterprise. This is why more and more we see across our customer base a willingness or even mandate by the enterprise to use managed services on the cloud instead of manually deploying software, which of course is more error prone at the enterprise scale. This is why Redis Labs focuses so much on our managed services and our first-party SaaS offerings, since they are really becoming the de facto way that enterprises deploy mission-critical workloads, in part for GRC reasons, but more specifically for this context, fraud risk management.
Thanks, Alan. That's super helpful to bring it to life in that perspective. Frank, I would love to have you weigh in on this. What do you think the propensity for fraud is today? And I guess more specifically, what you did back then, do you believe that would be possible today?
That's one of the most surprising things in my life. I'll be 73 next month, and having done this for 45 years, I cannot believe how every year crime gets easier to commit, 4,000 times easier than when I did it some 50 years ago. Of course, I didn't have the technology that exists today, or the ability to sit in my kitchen with a cup of coffee in my pajamas on a laptop and steal millions of dollars from someone thousands of miles away. And of course, I had to worry about being arrested. Today, you don't even have to worry about being captured, even if they know where you are, because as Alan pointed out, we don't have the jurisdiction to go get those criminals. So it is a very safe environment. So you can't really rely just on the police or rely on your bank or rely on your own company. You have to today spend a great deal of time learning how to protect yourself and protect yourself as a consumer. Now, the dollar amounts in fraud are just beyond belief. As you know, we've had more breaches in 2020 than we've had in the last 15 years, though we spent more than 10% on cybersecurity over the last year. And of course, as Alan pointed out, I believe every breach occurs because somebody in that company did something they weren't supposed to do, or somebody in that company failed to do something they were supposed to do. Hackers don't cause breaches, people do. And there are so many soft spots, both in our consumer, in our home, as well as in our corporations and financial institutions, that all hackers do is wait for doors to open, and there are thousands of doors to open. And then the amount of money is staggering. As you may know, the US government gave $630 billion to 50 US states for unemployment insurance during the pandemic. So far, $68 billion of that money has gone out in fraudulent claims from people who are collecting unemployment insurance. They live in India, Russia, China. And of course, today, we believe that number to be a lot higher. Some say as high as $100 billion or maybe even $200 billion. So what is most amazing to me is the amount of money that is being taken every day from just simple fraud. And that's fraud against the federal government, not to mention fraud against corporations and businesses. So you cannot go around simply thinking that it can't happen to me, I don't want to spend the money to fix it. If you don't do that, you're just asking to be a victim.
Thanks, Frank. So I really like the visual that you gave there in terms of a fraudster sitting at home in their pajamas, working from their kitchen table. So apparently that demographic is also working from home due to the pandemic. But in all seriousness, Alan, we're hearing more about this move from static profiles to digital identities. Can you provide some background on this? And then do we see trends amongst our own customers?
Yeah, so our customer base relies primarily on static profiles today, coupled with multi-factor authentication and other measures of risk management. It's a great use case for Redis Enterprise since it can serve millions of operations per second with cross-region business continuity to avoid an enterprise-wide outage. However, we have customers and are seeing more use cases for digital identity management as well. Let me answer this from one of their points of view. So according to BioCatch, a leader in the digital identity space and also a longtime Redis Labs customer on Azure, combating the use of stolen information for fraud starts by reducing our reliance on static identities. Since user profile data is private, it's inherently assumed to deter fraud. However, since static identity databases are not updated very often, they're likely more compromised because all it requires is one slip up by one of the many companies that store your private data on their servers. If you think about it, your static identity is typically the same across different enterprises. We're asked to provide our mother's maiden name or maybe our favorite pet. All information that can be derived from our social networks or hacked from one enterprise and used on another. As an example, the Equifax data breach alone exposed the confidential and private information on some 143 million consumers. This includes social securities and birth dates and addresses and more. That stolen information was more than enough for identity theft, creation of synthetic identities, and enablement of account takeovers. Digital identities are different because they are dynamic in nature. While digital identities do include some static elements, such as name and address, a mobile device number, they also include dynamic elements fueled by alternative data sources that represent an individual's behavior in the digital world. In fact, a digital identity is constantly updated based on information available from each digital transaction. In the case of BioCatch, that includes analyzing and tracking biometrics data, as in the way you actually hold your mobile device when you access your bank account. It's kind of creepy, but it's for your protection. So they can match your behavior against your digital profile for fidelity, which kind of makes me think of Westworld. There's no way to scrape that from Facebook or Twitter accounts. However, the challenge with building a system that can handle millions of daily updates to dynamic digital profiles and serves them back to you in real time is the data tier. And traditional databases were not built to handle this type of write and update throughput. Luckily, this is where Redis Enterprise shines. Redis Enterprise has been benchmarked to handle 200 million operations per second, both reads and writes. Its scalability, elasticity, high availability, and sub-millisecond performance to perfect fit for digital identities, including the ability to search across multiple dimensions such as geolocations, biometrics, and other various data sets that don't neatly fit into traditional database tables.
Thanks, Alan. So I think you brought up a great point, bringing in the themes of modern day social media and scraping information from Twitter and Facebook and such. So Frank, I would love to kind of pose the same question back to you. Can you weigh in on this and what you've experienced in your time?
Well, I'm actually 100% in agreement with Redis on the way they handle it. I look at firewalls as like a medieval castle with a wall around it. If I breach the wall, once I get in there, I can steal the static data that is there. You have to keep that information digital. You have to keep it constantly moving so that even if I breach the wall, I can't steal that information. We have 3.5 billion identities that have already been compromised. We have 14 billion identities that are available on the dark web. So most today, people have already had their identity stolen. I remind people, I am not on any form of social media whatsoever, or have I ever been. But I remind people that if you tell me on Facebook where you were born and your date of birth, that's 98% of me having the ability to steal your identity. So today we live in a way too much information world, and this is why it is very important to start looking at how do we keep this information safe and out of the hands of the wrong people.
Interesting. Alan, I want to pass it back to you now. So we did note that digital identities can potentially provide additional areas of fraud. Additional layers of fraud protection. However, we also noted that digital is more prone to fraud. So can you reconcile those two ideas?
Yeah, isn't that kind of like the counterintuitive nature of technology? We use technology for protection. However, it's also used against us. This creates like an endless race war between fraudsters and risk management teams. So as we said, digital identities do provide an extra layer of protection over static identities. However, they open the door to a relatively new and growing trend, at least in the digital space, called synthetic identity fraud. According to estimates by McKinsey, synthetic identity fraud is the fastest growing type of financial crime in the United States. Since it's not always caught or reported, it's actually hard to determine the full scale of its costs, but it's in the billions. Synthetic identities are built using a few points of real information. Sometimes all it takes is simply a social security number, which is usually available on the dark web, thanks to Equifax. Equipped with this, a fraudster can invent a name, age, date of birth, address, phone number to establish a synthetic identity. As a next step, the fraudster can slightly alter that fake information to create additional identities. In other words, they are effectively creating and managing a graph of fake identities that will eventually be connected to real financial accounts. This is further complicated by fraudsters who nurture these fake identities by making payments on time and don't exhibit other risk factors. So as time goes on and their credit limits credibly increase, detection progressively becomes more difficult, in some cases impossible. Therefore, the best defense against this type of identity fraud is to detect it at the top of the customer funnel, such as the account creation or the initial payment processing, before the profile gains credibility, becoming harder to detect. I'll let Frank verify this, but it feels similar to what he did pre-digital age. Detecting fake identities is all about connections, which makes this a challenging and costly effort without using a graph database. A graph database can detect suspicious connections by traversing digital identities based on relationships. Since in this case, time is of the essence, it would be advantageous to analyze these connections in real time instead of it becoming a big data problem. In other words, more complicated and expensive problem. This is where Redis can simplify things. Redis supports a graph model called Redis Graph, which uses in-memory sparse adjacency matrices to natively store data as a property graph and linear algebra to query it. Graph semantics such as nodes and relationships can be expressed using a standard query language referred to as Cipher, CQL, which is perfect to analyze synthetic identities to detect one or more pieces of unique real information that is shared. Since Redis Graph is built on Redis, this can be done in real time during account creation or in parallel to in-flight online transactions, which is going to be a real game changer to detection of synthetic identities.
Awesome. So Alan teed us up nicely there, Frank, by bringing up synthetic identities. So based on my understanding, during your youth, digital synthetic identities were not yet a thing. However, you essentially did something similar by piecing together a network of connected information to create false identities. So first off, do I have that right? And if so, can you enlighten us on synthetic identities?
You have that absolutely correct. And as a matter of fact, in 2007, I wrote a white paper on synthetic identity theft. It's on my website at abagnale.com under articles with Frank Abagnale. Basically, I don't sell anything on my website. I don't promote anything on my website. It's strictly an educational site. So I put things that I write up on my website. And in 2007, I wrote about synthetic identity theft. I was very concerned at the time of being used for terrorism. The ability for me to come in here, obtain a death certificate of a child who died as an infant, taking the death certificate, to get a birth certificate, taking the birth certificate, to get a driver's license, taking the driver's license and birth certificate, to get a passport, and establishing one's identity. I have tested several times, and people will find this unbelievable, but I have tested several times where I literally could go tomorrow and fill out an application for a gas oil company card. Put down a phony name, forget about changing the social security number, just making up a social security number, making up a date of birth. All of the information on the application that I'm writing is actually false. Then I send that application in. The gas company gets it, sends it to their credit bureau, Equifax, Experian, TransUnion. the credit union comes back, says no file on this individual, no credit history. So I get a nice letter that says, thank you for your request for our gas card. However, because of no credit history, we cannot offer you a card at this time. I turn right around and send that same application to another gas company, where now the credit bureau has set up that file. So that company then says there is a file, but there's no history, but maybe we'll go ahead and give this guy $200 credit line, and if he pays his bills on time, we'll increase his credit. And I will do that, and I will pay the bills on time, and then I'll get another card and another card, and over a short period of time, I'll establish an identity where I could get into a mortgage or something where I get a bank loan. That works now without me even going to actual information. And the only other point I would make up is back in 2012, Carnegie Mellon went out to interview 40,000 children across America in all 50 states to ask them one simple question, and that was in all walks of life at all ages, if they had had their identity stolen. 10% of them had their identity stolen. That was in 2012. I remind people all the time, if you were asking me, whose identity would you rather have? A 65-year-old multimillionaire who owns tons of real estate and you have all of his data, or a 12-year-old boy who's in elementary school and you have no data? I want the 12-year-old boy, because if I can take that 12-year-old boy's identity, I can become that 12-year-old boy for the next several years. And God forbid I get the Social Security number of that infant coming out of the hospital, because then I can become that infant for the next 20 years. And that person won't be looking for credit or applying for credit for a long time and never know I stole their identity. I can resell that identity over and over. So synthetic identity theft has two sides of it, the financial concern and also the terrorist concern of synthetic identity theft.
Interesting. Yeah, there's very much a human concern there. Allen, next question's for you. So similar to the migration towards digital identities, there is a trend of moving from rule-based fraud detection to artificial intelligence. Is Redis Labs doing anything to address this?
Yes, of course. So artificial intelligence and machine learning models, for those not familiar, use sophisticated mathematical and statistical algorithms, which exploit patterns and what's called derived inferences to quickly determine a relative likelihood of an outcome to occur, essentially a prediction. Within the context of fraud detection, enterprises use these algorithms to analyze individual components of a transaction and determine the probability that it is unauthorized or fraudulent or coming from a stolen credit card. The probability of fraud, cross-referenced with its potential impact, is referred to as a transactions risk score. Real-time transaction scoring algorithms that are computed as part of the transaction path consider transaction details, user profiles, behavioral metrics, geolocation, device metadata, bank information, everything we mentioned with digital identities. AI and ML models can learn, just like our brains, with each iteration by storing inferences derived from prior transactions. This improves their accuracy of their risk assessment. Now, there are many stages to deploying AI and ML models into production, including algorithm design, staging, accurate data, training the actual models, and production deployment. Now, Redis Enterprise simplifies the operational part of production deployment with its inherent enterprise capabilities and solves the network performance problem due to the model's need for inference data, both input and derived output. Redis solves this with Redis AI by co-locating the AI and ML model with that inference data in memory, which could be terabytes of data. This eliminates network hops, which allows transaction risk scoring to be performed in real time. For those of you interested in real-time inferencing, there's actually a really good session at this year's RedisConf next month by DoorDash on how they, quote, built a gigascale machine learning feature store with Redis. It's going to be a really exciting session. There's going to be additional ones on Redis AI. So if you guys join, I hope you check it out.
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, that's a really in-depth topic. So I think we should keep going with that. Frank, what are your thoughts on AI for fraud and how do you see this trend going?
I think AI is the future. Of course, it's less like anything other new technology like blockchain or AI. Some human being has to put the information in there. So if I put a false identity into blockchain, then it becomes permanent. It's the same way what we have to make sure that we know what's going into AI technology to make sure that technology is being used safely. But I definitely believe that it is the future. And I think that what we have to do is, like at all new technologies, make sure we've taken all the little risks out of those technologies and fix all the imperfections before we put those technologies in the marketplace.
That makes a lot of sense. Alan, you've talked a lot today about, why this topic is important to our customers, but can you shed a little bit more light on how specifically Redis Labs is viewing this? So where is Redis Labs focused within the domain of fraud detection today?
So, a challenge of fraud detection is that fraudsters are often intelligent. They learn from their mistakes and continuously innovate new ways to commit fraud. It's literally their profession, right? So, however, since fraud is often performed at scale and by many actors, there are enough data points to capture known fraud patterns. This is where anomaly detection can play a role. Anomaly detection is the identification of rare events or observations which raise suspicions by differing significantly from the assumed or forecasted pattern. In online digital systems, data can be expressed as signals along a time series, which makes it easier to use algorithms to identify anomalies, preferably as they occur in real time. A time series model is a sequence of data points, typically consisting of successive measurements made over some time interval. And time series-based anomaly detection is used to find outliers relative to forecasted values, or more commonly, a confidence interval, which is statistically calculated as a bounded distribution based on previously observed data. Once we observe an outlier outside of the confidence interval, we can refer to it for downstream forensic analysis. So financial institutions require anomalies to be detected in near real time, ingest large amounts of data, and adapt to changes in user behavior, each of which is a major challenge for traditional relational databases. They just weren't built for this type of workload. This is where Redis simplifies things. Redis is a time series model called Redis time series, which supports high volume ingestion and low latency queries. Point in time queries can be aggregated, retention policies are configurable, data can be downsampled, and a time series can be queried across multiple dimensions supported by secondary indexes. As with all Redis models, it's in memory, so you get real-time performance that enables instantaneous alerting or potentially action in response to these detected anomalies. So, this is just one more flavor of how Redis Enterprise focuses in on fraud detection. We mentioned earlier digital identities and being able to scale static profiles, having the business continuity to make sure it's not a single point of failure. We also mentioned synthetic identities and being able to match that in terms of a graph, and obviously managing the connections and being able to, in real time, identify those synthetic identities, and also AI models. So we're really traversing the different problems that are out there within the fraud detection space and making sure that we can solve these problems in real time at digital scale. So that's really is the speed of those channels today.
Thanks, Alan. Building on that, Frank, can you provide your experience on statistical analysis and anomaly detection within the fraud detection domain? And I guess two-part question, how do you see this changing today in today's digital world?
Well, I worked for 10 years on it as an advisor to a technology called the 41st parameter, which was eventually purchased by Experian. That was a fraud detection technology. And we know that there are about 21 parameters that credit bureaus use to approve credit and identify individuals. At that time, we were developing a technology that looked over 100 different pieces of information to identify who that individual was. So I agree that analyzing fraud can be done in real time and can help block attempts. I also believe that analyzing a time series of transactions can help show the forest from the trees and the reality that one transaction is connected to many other transactions. So I agree with Alan that this is the future in the way of dealing with digital information and fraud detection. If you go back even years ago, when I used to work with a lot of banks, everything was kept a record of a history of how you operated. So if you were writing a check and the largest check you ever wrote was $4,000 a month to pay your mortgage, then you wrote a check for $18,000, it was kicked out because that was not a common thing that you did. And the same way, if you were on check number 210 and all of a sudden check 4016 came up, that was kicked out because it was out of sequence. So that old technology is being done today in a much faster real-time speed of being able to detect things through that type of technology today, digital.
Awesome, thank you. That's super, super helpful. So we are a little bit ahead of schedule. So I think I'm going to pivot and maybe take, it looks like we've got a couple of questions in the Q&A here. So Frank, there's one for you here. It says, is there a need for strong public-private organization cooperation? And do you see increased interest to solve these issues from the public sector?
I think there is interest from the public sector, but we're not doing it fast enough. Sometimes people ask me, who do you trust more with your money and your information, the government or your bank? A bank like Chase Bank spends more than $500 million a year just increasing their technology, making their technology better, vetting their technology. The government continues to have outrageous numbers of fraud, $100 billion in Medicare fraud, unemployment fraud. Every single year it is the same number. No company could survive doing that. So the criminal has realized who's an easy target, the government. Who has all the money? The government. So today, I think we have to work together to solve these problems. And when there is a problem, when there is, for example, a breach, we can't take 135 days to fix it. We can't wait 69 days to alert the public there's been a breach. We need to be able to do things in real time and be able to fix things in real time. Otherwise, we're just giving the criminal an open door and other opportunities to just commit more crime while we're trying to fix that with a vendor or trying to fix that internally.
Yep, absolutely. Real time is key here. I think that was a great answer, Frank. One from the audience over to you as well, Alan, and then we can go ahead and kind of conclude here. But Steve asked, do you think that Redis is being leveraged for nefarious activities like identity theft? And if so, how is Redis or Redis Labs, I guess, defending against this?
If I understood the question correctly in terms of being actually used by fraudsters, I imagine it is. We mentioned earlier about the omni-channel approach. If you were to build out a kind of a synthetic identity using Redis Graph, that might have a really good effect if you were trying to attack some kind of enterprise across an omni-channel, learning from one and being able to connect that data and that information that you were able to gather as part of that identity, and being able to leverage that. And what's really important here with the context of Redis Labs and Redis Enterprise, and I'm not promoting this obviously to any fraudsters that might be watching, but you could achieve this at scale. And I think we talked about it earlier, where by introducing new digital channels, that is the way the world is going, of course, and it should. We also invite, as Frank mentioned, if you're not protecting against fraud, you're kind of inviting it. So we're inviting fraud really at a global scale. And these particular fraudsters, I made the comments earlier, they're really smart. It's literally their job. There's not a lot of opportunity for them potentially in other parts of the world. But if they have a computer and enough information to be able to figure out how to hack away, do some social engineering, or create an algorithm out there that's smart enough to beat the enterprise, they'll probably do it. And with a technology like Redis, you could basically be able to do that at scale, because at the end of the day, for some of these hackers, it's just a matter of a numbers game. Frank sometimes talks about the amount of investment JP Morgan and other banks make towards fraud detection. We're talking about millions and millions and millions of dollars. But at the end of the day, it just takes one person to make a mistake. I spoke about earlier a shared responsibility model. It just takes one person to miss a configuration or not deploy something on the network. And if you are playing a numbers game and attacking at scale, that might be enough of an entry point. And once you're in there, a lot of these fraudsters, they don't necessarily take money right away. We sometimes think of people kind of like stealing in the sense of, I'm going to go grab what I can while I can. Maybe Frank could allude to this a little more. I'd love to hear his perspective. But sometimes they sit and they wait and they learn, and they learn more about the other systems, and they leverage the fact that they're already inside to gain access to other accounts. We've seen some pretty large, fraud activity, especially in Europe, where they stole, tens of millions of euros, and it was done because they were already inside the bank for many, many years. So sometimes they have the patience and they wait, and they then leverage that information where they can make the most impact. And again, using a technology like Redis would allow them to, at scale, find that entry point into one of these large enterprises. We do not endorse that kind of behavior from Redis Labs.
We'll pass it over to Frank. Any commentary or anything to add?
Yeah. 4 or 5 years ago, I live in Charleston, South Carolina. Someone hacked into the tax revenue office, stole 3.5 million tax returns of the citizens of South Carolina. That was the entire return. So they had your social security number, your wife's social security number. If you had children, claimed them as dependents, they had your children's social security number. And of course, at the time then, our governor, Nikki Haley, decided that she was going to provide 1-year credit monitoring service for everybody in the state of South Carolina, and the government would pick up the tab. I didn't know the governor, but I sent her an email and told her that that would be a waste of the taxpayers' money and a waste of the taxpayers' time. People who steal mass data warehouse that data, typically for 3 to 4 years, before they bring it back out in the marketplace. First of all, you already told everyone that you're going to give everybody a year credit monitoring service, so obviously they would be foolish to start using that information in that time period. But we find that typically when you have a breach or you have identities stolen, they warehouse those identities for 3 or 4 years before anyone knows it starts to actually use those identities, and they're more valuable when they go to sell them. And that's exactly what we saw with South Carolina. It was probably almost 4 years we started to see people's identities being affected from a breach that occurred 4 years earlier. And at that point, the average consumer is not even thinking about that. They're thinking, oh, someone must have got my information when I went to the drugstore and asked me these questions. No, they got it 3 or 4 years ago. So there's billions and billions of pieces of information being stolen. Data is money. And you just hold on to that. You can always sell it. And the longer you hold on to it, the more valuable it becomes. So it's very, very important today to be able to understand that when things happen, they don't just immediately go out. And as Alan pointed out, even in the breach of Equifax, they got into Equifax and sat there for 6 months. They wanted to know what information Equifax had and what information would be most valuable to them before they ever breached Equifax system. So yes, these people are smart. They have the technology to use it, and they have the will to want to use it. And so we have to be very cooperative, working with all of us together, government, private sector, even education, in helping people defeat that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So Alan, I want to give you one more section just to kind of close this out, because I think it's interesting. So we're talking about technology for bad here, but I want to give you the floor in terms of, why Redis Labs, why partnering up with us, and where we kind of fit in what we've just been describing.
Yeah, I think it goes back to being able to match up with the scale that's requested nowadays at the consumer side, right? The behavior has changed. Generationally speaking, people have grown up with a cell phone. I grew up in the kind of AOL dial-up, and I think nowadays everyone expects broadband and instantaneous kind of experiences. So being able to keep up with those kinds of channels, really technology, when it was built in the 50s, database technology, it wasn't built to handle that kind of scale. So using a technology that allows you to scale out, allows you to perform in real time, it really changes the game, because now you can be a part of an actual payment process instead of just thinking about fraud after the fact in terms of a data warehouse or overnight reporting, or maybe claims adjudication. We're also seeing all this new kinds of fraud, like I mentioned, with synthetic identities. So being able to potentially solve that problem with a graph, that's not something that was so simple to model with a relational table. Doing things like anomaly detection, again, relational tables weren't built to do things like that. Heavy ingestion, point in time querying, temporal kind of modeling. And the real value proposition here is that you can do all of that with a single database, still have the same exact operational efficiencies, the same experience. You don't have to learn about, you don't have technology sprawl or vendor sprawl across your enterprise. You're able to really, personalize for your specific business how you want to solve that fraud problem. And you can do that at scale with a single database that's really easy to use and provides you, 5 nines availability, high availability, and everything you need specifically to keep up with your, mission critical applications.
Simplify at scale. That was great. So we are kind of coming to the conclusion of our conversation today. So I have one more question for each of you. Frank, I will let you go first. We've covered a wide variety of topics today. Any advice for our listeners or any words of wisdom you want to send them parting on?
Well, what I'm hoping is that we're going to wake up in the next few years and do away with passwords. I've been saying that for years and years now. Passwords are for tree houses. They were invented in 1964 when I was 16 years old, before I had done any of the things I did. And today, approaching 73, we are still using passwords. 83% of breaches, ransomware, intrusions come from passwords. We have got to get rid of passwords. There are a number of companies in the US that are doing that now and developing the technology to eliminate sign-ins and passwords, identifying you by your device, your telephone. So you may have seen recently an ad where Sabrina Williams is running through the marketplace and she only has a jogging outfit. She sees a necklace she wants to buy. She only has her phone. So she walks over to a Chase ATM. She presses a bank's app on her phone. She gets her money, no card, no password. That's what I'm hoping. I've been working the last 6 years advising one of those companies that is trying to eliminate passwords. But I think in the next 2 or 3 years, we'll get rid of passwords, not only domestically, but worldwide. And when we do that, we will start to put a big dent in a lot of the digital fraud.
Wonderful. I think we all need passwords or for tree houses t-shirts coming out of this conversation. Alan, same question to you.
Yeah, I mean, we've all heard, different predictions about how the pandemic, accelerated our entry into the digital economy. I've heard 7 months equaling 7 years of progress for cloud adoption. I've heard, 2 months double the e-commerce footprint of the past decade. That might all be true, but I think setting aside predictions, something we can all likely draw consensus on is that most post-pandemic, we're most likely going to not revert completely to the pre-COVID operating model. So digital is here to stay. And the investment is going to continue to come, operating models, and of course the cloud is here to stay. So as we mentioned at the top, with that comes risk exposure for fraud. But here's the bright side. Now more than ever, risk managers are equipped with tools that can scale and perform at the speed of those customer channels I mentioned. That means fraud detection no longer has to be a second-class citizen to the business process. Instead, it could be a part of it. Since fraud is not some monolithic problem that has a one-size-fits-all solution, as I mentioned, the benefit of using a multi-model database such as Redis provides enterprises with the flexibility they need to personalize that solution without compromising on those operational efficiencies, that performance, that availability guarantee, or being coupled to a specific vendor like in the past or a cloud provider. Obviously, I'd recommend Redis Enterprise as that multi-model database, but I'm a bit biased. Jokes aside, I'm a fairly optimistic person. So, if I was to put on my risk management hat, I'd be excited about the opportunities and challenges that lie ahead. Your enterprises will likely begin, if it hasn't happened already, to take off the cuffs, so to speak, which allows you to, to do more, to try new things as, regulatory fines and kind of more things are in the headlines. So if you're interested in this, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, check out some of the content about fraud detection on our website. In case I don't have a chance, I want to thank Frank Abagnale again for joining us today. I thought his insight was fantastic. Thank you for all of that. And of course, thank you, Haley, for being our moderator here today. Cheers, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the session.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
It has been a pleasure. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Frank. It has been interesting. It's been insightful. For those of you in our audience that are attending today and found this topic relevant, insightful, I would love to extend an invitation to you to Redis Conference, our user-based conference, which is occurring next month. We've got a really intriguing speaker lineup, but specific to this group, Mike Lee, the head of Capital One's enterprise payment architecture, will be keynoting at Redis Conference. So that's going to be occurring on April 20th and 21st. We will be sure to send you that invitation and additional details in follow-up today. But check us out there. Find Alan on LinkedIn. And thank you, Frank. This was great.
Thank you.